What's up, everybody? This is Nate with Rooted in Revelation podcast, where we seek to make God's revelation our foundation in all of life. And with me, I have a special guest, Conley Owens. How you doing, Conley?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
Good, man. Well, thanks for coming on. This is a privilege to be able to kind of host you and host one of your books that you just published. So thanks, man.
Yeah, you're welcome. Absolutely.
Yeah, so for my listeners, including myself, who don't know you from Adam, maybe you can share a little bit about who you are and what you're doing.
Well, we have some mutual friends, so I think we
right.
do know each other closer than that. Yeah, from choosing hats,
Right.
or the old choosing hats days. Yeah, so my name's Conley Owens. I'm a pastor at Silicon Valley Reformed Baptist Church. I live with my wife and 7 kids here in Sunnyvale, California. I'm a bivocational pastor, so I'm also a software engineer at one of the larger software companies around here. I'll let you guess
Nice.
which one that is.
Yeah, I actually don't know. So maybe I shouldn't ask. I don't know if it's like X-Files or something like
Oh
that.
yeah, I'm at Google.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so maybe you can tell us the inside scoop. Maybe Google knows
Yeah,
a little
well,
bit. Yeah.
what I tell people is that all the Babylon Bee headlines are true.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know. Maybe you could tell us more about this. Well, that I guess that's Facebook. I was thinking of Facebook and the metaverse coming out or whatever. But looking forward to that. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, man, it's a privilege. But so you said you have 7 kids.
Yes, and an 8th on the way.
Congrats. That's really good stuff. I got one on the way as well. And my buddy, the one that actually goes to log college, he has currently 4 girls, and they just found out they're having twin girls now. So 2 more
Nice.
to the mix. Yeah. So he's
wow.
all girls. Yeah. So lots of kids. It's a good thing. Need more Christians in this world. So exciting thing, stuff coming up. So, but yeah, man. So you came out with this book. I'm not sure exactly when it came out, but it's called the Dorian Principle, correct?
Right. Yeah. So you mentioned the log college and seminary. This was my MDiv thesis, and I thought I was just going to cull some information and then publish it, but I ended up rewriting tons of it. And yeah, so that's where this came out of.
Great. And so for someone that's wondering what the heck is the Dorian
Sure.
Principle, maybe you can help us understand what that is, or that concept.
Yeah. Well, here's a quick picture of the book. So, if
Great.
anybody looks for it on Amazon or whatever, you'll find it. But yeah, so Dorian is the Greek word, the Greek adverb that means freely. Jesus said in Matthew 10:8, freely you receive, freely give. And Paul uses the same word to talk about preaching freely, not charging for ministry. Now, right after that verse, Jesus says in Matthew 10:9 through 10, the worker's worthy of his food. And in Luke, it says the worker's worthy of his wages. So it's a book about how do you hold those two things together? How are we supposed to give without being paid for it? And also to expect payment for this. And a lot of people have had either poor resolutions or they've had good resolutions that they haven't worked out all the implications of. So what I'm trying to do is offer one of those good resolutions and then work out all the implications of it. And so what I believe the distinction is that Jesus is setting forward and that Paul is exemplifying in his own ministry, and even other apostles are also alluding to, John and 3 John being one of them, but is a distinction between co-labor and reciprocity. So when Jesus says, freely you've received, freely give, he's saying there should be no reciprocity with the gospel. You should not be exchanging it, expecting anything in return from that person. However, there is supposed to be co-labor. Other fellow servants in the kingdom are supposed to be supporting you in this work. So yes, there is supposed to be a payment, but it's not coming from customers. It's coming from the true employer, who is God. Because in that context, both in Luke and in Matthew, the Lord, he is God. He is the Lord of the harvest who is sending out workers into the field. He is the employer. We should be expecting him to support his servants through the hands of other servants, not through customers, not through the mission field. So that's in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And when you say what's the word what was it?
Reciprocity. Yeah.
Reciprocity.
So
what's that mean?
Yeah, it's funny.
I can't even say
I chose that word very carefully, but most of the people, when they first encounter it, they have a hard time saying it. So yeah, I was trying to find a word that means exchange, right? Remuneration doesn't really work because there is, a remuneration, like God does pay his servants. they ought to be supported by fellow servants. And there's words that might suggest quid pro quo, which I'm not necessarily interested in something, a word that specifies a symmetry in exchange, because you could have an asymmetric exchange that violates this too. If you offer someone the gospel for 5 cents, you still engaged in reciprocity, even if it's not been a very symmetric exchange, even though it's a very asymmetric one. So reciprocity just implies there's been some kind of exchange of the gospel for something else. And what is so offensive about that, and I guess there's a lot of things you could point to, but one of the ones that Paul brings up is when you're doing that, you are suggesting that you're a free agent. In 1 Corinthians 9, he talks about this, that you're a free agent, not a servant of another who is bound to do this thing. And Paul gives all kinds of analogies in 1 Corinthians 9, with a soldier. And a lot of people look at those analogies because Paul is talking about his right to be supported. And they read those as saying that Paul has a right to charge for his ministry, even though he's saying that he would never do such a thing, right? But if you think about that, the soldier, if he were to take money directly from the people, not as taxation to the king, but as directly for himself, he'd be guilty of extortion, right? But if he takes from the people as taxes to the king, and the king is supplying for the soldier, he's doing it correctly. 1 Corinthians 9 also appeals to the Levites. How were the Levites supported? Yes, they were supported by the Israelites, but the obligation from the Israelites to the Levites was not a direct one, it was an indirect one. They were making their tithes and their sacrifices to the Lord. It would have been idolatry if they had been giving directly to the Levites, or if the Levites had asked directly, don't sacrifice to the Lord, let me just have this thing directly. And that's what happened with Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli. They asked for the sacrifice before it had been boiled, before it had been offered to God. So there is an obligation that people have to ministers, even the ones who are teaching them, but it's not a direct obligation, right? We are obligated to the Lord, and out of our obligation for the Lord, we should be supporting fellow ministers. So yeah, all this coming together to show that it's wrong for ministers to be asking for a direct exchange or expecting some kind of direct exchange, or even accepting it, even if they weren't expecting it. But it is right for them to co-labor and coordinate with other servants to make sure their gospel work is supported.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's really helpful. So I guess what are some, maybe you could share some examples of some of the models of different kind of ministry models for these very things, these very principles, you could say.
Right. Yeah. Now this is where it gets controversial, because I'm gonna point out the sacred cows that very, very typical ways that ministry is done today. And I do mean today. I think this is a recent problem. A lot of people take me as saying that, I've got this right and no one else has figured this out for 2,000 years or whatever. I think this is a very modern problem. Things like books, right? Ministry that is conducted by books, typically, you can't even access the contents of this religious instruction until you pay me, right? And then I give it to you. Or conferences, you want to come and hear the gospel. I launched this book at G3, and one of the illustrations I would make for people, if you wanted to watch this online right now, you would have to pay $14.99 to do so. And then seminaries, a lot of seminaries, they charge tuition. Now, a lot of them are maybe 70% supported by co-labor, where people are donating, but then that last 30% they get directly out of an exchange from the student to learn more about the gospel, to experience some kind of spiritual improvement. And yeah, that's exactly what Simon was going for. He thought it was right for the gospel to be purchased by to exchange money for spiritual improvement, and it's not appropriate. Now, just to be clear, I'm saying that this is primarily a problem with the ministries that are acting in this way, not necessarily with the people who are don't have an option but to pay.
Yeah, that's really helpful. It's a very interesting topic, because it's not something that probably floats around people's minds a whole lot. It's just kind of one of them things you take for granted, or you just assume and you go about your life. I mean, we all
Right.
know about TV evangelist. I mean, that's probably like the worst case scenario.
Right.
So
yeah, and I don't know if you've read the short intro to the book, or the what's on the back of the book, but basically it says, everybody knows that what they're doing is wrong, but what distinguishes that from what legitimate ministries are doing, where they're engaging in the commerce of, exchanging religious instruction for money.
Yeah. Do you have any theories or any ideas of how this came to be this way, or why, or like maybe even just some of the history behind this? Is this kind of like a modern problem versus it being not a modern problem? Or
Sure. Yeah, I do think it is more of a modern problem. And I would like to study this more. I do have some things about history in the book, but I think a neat follow-up project, if I get some time for it, would be to catalog a few things and then come up with some low-budget documentary about the commercialization of Christianity. I think that'd be a lot of fun. But just to recount the whole history, because I think it's valuable to go way back. In the book, I document several sub-apostolic resources, so like the Didache or the Shepherd of Hermas, or the writings of Apollonius, which are not extant, but are recorded by Eusebius. And these three all talk about how if someone comes to you asking for money, you're to consider him a false prophet, right? If he comes to you offering teaching for money, you're to consider him a false teacher and to send him on his way, is more or less how the Didache puts it. And the others say pretty much the same thing. So in the beginning, I believe this was a practice that was well understood. With more doctrinal items, you might find that there's very little clarity, and then it grows over time. With more practical items, what you find is that because they are in practice, there's actually a lot of clarity, and then it corrupts over time and then has to be restored later. So that's kind of what was going on with this. And then over time, that becomes corrupted until it gets really bad before the time of the Reformation. And the whole Reformation was sparked around this issue, right? Around the sale of salvation, the sale of indulgences, exchanging spiritual improvement for money. Now, the problem was so bad that you don't really need like a careful and nuanced response to it, right? You just need to say this is wrong, and Luther does, and not so many words, and then, well, and lots of words, but not necessarily, finally picking apart everything that's right or wrong about it. And so later on, things are going along mostly fine. And what I'd say would trigger the new need for reformation was the advent of modern copyright law in 1710. In 1710, you have the Statute of Ban. Now, what that allowed is for authors to begin profiting off of their books, to begin making royalties. Because the way it worked before was that an author just really wanted to get his work out there, so he'd give it to a publisher, and if the publisher thought he could make money out of it, he, as a distinct secular entity, would try making money off of it. But the author had no interest in that. Or maybe if they did, they would just write a dedication at the beginning and then hope that whatever society or queen or king they dedicated it to would support them in the work that they're doing. But with the advent of modern copyright law, you then have the beginning of royalties, and people start making businesses out of this. Now, I don't know the speed or rapidity at which the church followed along the world's model in doing this, but sure enough, the church did follow along. And so in the past 300 years, you've had that. And then more recently, you've had the advent of digital media, where now you're not even selling, primarily paper and ink, and then, the teaching along with it. You're now primarily selling the content, and the paper and ink are secondary, right? And you can go online and purchase the ebook, and there you're just getting the content. You're not getting a physical good. So it's really clear that the teaching is being sold. And I think that now is the time that as I look over history and different things where there's some kind of corruption and need for reformation, I think it really fits with the pattern. I don't think that I'm saying anything too wild to say that or like I think some people would characterize me as saying that, oh, everybody's gotten this wrong for 2,000 years, and, I'm getting it right now. I think we're just at a point in time where we need a little more clarity than what was previously retrieved.
Great. Yeah. So maybe probably one of your favorite objections. I'm trying to think of a good one. Oh, well, so pastors and teachers can't make money, right?
Right. No. Yeah. So I have this, there's this distinction between reciprocity and co-labor, and co-labor 100%. I'm a Reformed Baptist, so I believe the Second London Baptist Confession. If any of your audience is familiar with the Westminster Confession and not the Second London Baptist Confession, they won't know this, but in the section on the church that the Reformed Baptist Confession adds, it mentions that ideally pastors ought to be supported so they can be full-time. And I 100% believe that. I happen to be bivocational, so a lot of people think that I think that that's the ideal. I don't. I really wish I were full-time. And that would be the ideal, for pastors to be supported well so that they're able to fully devote themselves to prayer and ministry of the word, and to be able to be hospitable to others.
Gotcha. So as far as for, this idea that you brought up with for example, say Tim Keller writes a new book, right? And he sells it or whatever, and makes money or makes some kind of profit from that. Are you saying that's the target of being like, yeah, that we shouldn't do that because it has to do with ministry or the gospel? So would that be an example primarily of something like that?
I think that is a good example. Now, use the word profit, which I've avoided using, because my concern is not about whether or not they make more money than they put in. It's whether there's been any reciprocity at all, right? Even if it's a penny, it's too much, and not because it's not worth it, or not because he's not put that much effort into it. I think he should be supported well, just not by means of reciprocity. It should be by fellow servants of the Lord laboring with him. And yeah, and a lot of people, the conclusion they come to, seeing these same passages as I do, but not necessarily spending a whole lot of time trying to, make sure they've got them all consistently, is they'll come to that conclusion that, oh, well, as long as you're not profiting, as long as you're just making, not asking for more than you put into it, or you had to pay for to do whatever, it's okay. I don't believe that's the case. The Bible doesn't say that it's okay to peddle the gospel as long as you're not making more than what you got out of it. You're not allowed to peddle the gospel at all. 2 Corinthians 2:17. And just one more bonus there. Tim Keller, you mentioned him. He's one of the examples I point out in the book, because he's one of the few people who still sells his sermons. That grew out of practice quite a while ago. But he still does. And if you want to download all his whole collection, and not just individually, they will send you a flash drive if you pay them $1,600. And that's down from a list price of $3,300. So this kind of stuff still happens. And I think that's a shame. The gospel is to be offered without money and without price, as Isaiah 55 says, and then Revelation picks up on the same thing. That's the gospel. It should be offered freely.
Right. And it does make the one verse that comes to mind is when Paul, I believe, he talks about some people preaching the gospel for selfish ambition and for gain. And he says something along the lines of, being against that, but in the sense he's grateful that God's word still being proclaimed nevertheless. Right.
Right. Yes. I do mention that in the book. Specifically when considering, well, what should we do? Should we, ban these ministries or boycott them? And I say, no, we should be glad when the gospel is going forward, even not with the sincerity that it ought to be. And that is, and I say sincerity, you might think, well, are you saying these people aren't sincere? That is kind of the thesis of this book, is that to have this ulterior motive is to undermine your sincerity, whether it's in great measure or in little measure. You are undermining the sincerity of ministry by having this ulterior motive of money and exchanging the gospel for money.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of I'm aware of some authors that I don't know all the ins and outs of how they go about that, but specifically I think Ephraim and Poythress, I know they are two authors that put a lot of their stuff out there for free. You want the free PDF, right, all their books or whatever. Maybe not all of them. It might depend on who's the publishers and stuff like that. But yeah.
I don't know too much about what Frame's practices have been, but I know Poythress has thought through this a good bit, and I feel like they're as I've read their writings, their reasonings about this are a little different, and I sympathize more with what I see from Poythress. But he actually came to his conclusions on a similar journey that I did, because we both were fairly involved in open source software. If you don't know what that is, basically, it's software that takes a more innovative view of copyright so that people are free to modify the software, and the software is given away for free, and you find other ways of making money off of what you're providing. So anyway, Poythress was also involved in the free software movement, and so that led him to rethink the way the church treated copyright. And I went about this the same way. I kind of had the same path as him. So he he offers his writings under the GNU Free Documentation License, which I think is so cool, because that's like just a really old school license for for software documentation. What I argue in the book is that ideally we should be doing public domain declarations where we don't require any kind of license compliance, any kind of obligation placed on the one who's receiving the ministry. I think is going too far.
That's really cool. Yeah. I guess, man. Yeah, there's all kinds of things bouncing around in my head now, but I guess maybe if you want to talk a little bit about how seminary or tuition. I know you kind of talk about the things involved there. Like, for example, I think of Poythress. He is a seminary professor at Westminster, Philadelphia.
Right.
So would that what he's doing there be considered separated from what's the word, co-laboring or I guess I'm trying to find the right words, but maybe you know what I'm getting at.
Sure. Yeah. Is that co-labor or reciprocity? Well,
yeah.
If he's receiving it from the seminary, it's kind of hard, like what to pin on him and what to pin on the seminary, because he's not charging the students. It's the seminary that's charging the students. And like, at what level of indirection does it become okay? And I don't have answers to all these questions, but yeah, I do think that the seminary should not be charging the students. And you have some seminaries are in a little bit of a harder spot where they wouldn't necessarily know what to do. But for these seminaries that come out of a particular denomination, there's a real fast track to, just making these things supported by the denomination. And ideally, that's how it would go.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful to think of it in those terms for sure. Because I know.
Because a lot of these churches are paying for it anyway, just, at the time that they're sending the student. Why not just go ahead and do that beforehand as co-labor? And there's just a lot. You might hear that and think, well, that's just it's all semantics at that point. Why does it matter? It really does matter, because the way you think about it when you're giving to this as a ministry is very different. When I purchase a book, I never have a second thought about maybe I should be praying for this guy, or maybe I should be holding him accountable to the things that he does elsewhere. But when you give to a ministry, you want to hold them accountable. You want to make a good investment. You want to be praying for them. And you want to have, excitement and joy about this investment you're making. None of that happens when you're engaged in a commercial model of reciprocity.
Yeah. I've never even thought to consider, you're putting money into a specific commercialized idea or seminary or some kind of something advertisement, and you never think to really think through it like that. So that's really helpful and interesting. So, in regards to what was I had something I wanted to say. Okay. So, like, for example, have you thought about how we should, as buyers of these is my internet okay?
I lost you for a second, but keep going.
Okay, is it okay? Sorry, I just said it was unstable, but I was going to ask you, in regards to us that maybe purchase these books or purchase the stuff, what have you thought through that at all? And maybe you could share a little bit of your thoughts regarding that.
Right. Yeah. So like I said,
books,
right. Yeah. So like I said, I don't think we should boycott these ministries. It would be, even personally harmful to not avail yourself of all those resources if you have the funds for it. However, at the same time, I do think it should shape some of your decision making. Maybe you're used to going to one resource when another resource is just as good, and you want to go, maybe you would want to patronize, for lack of a better word, the one that is more faithful in terms of this policy. For myself, I've decided not to invest in things like Logos, because I just feel like that's a little too much of a racket. I'd rather just use the other kind of software packages that are available, that are freely available. So yeah, it might shape some of your decision making, and it should shape the way, for example, that you think about your giving at church. Maybe a lot of people are inclined to think, oh, well, I come here, I've got this real consumer mindset where I come here, I pay the pastor because he does this thing for me. But really, what's going on in that context? Your pastor is one of the members of the church who is giving his life over to, dedicate himself to the ministry of the word and prayer. you are foregoing some of the fruit of your labor so that, he can do this. And you're all working together, suffering for the sake of the gospel. Something that I found very enlightening as I saw someone point this out is that Paul, in the 3 times he lists all his persecutions, that he's shipwrecked, that he's beaten, etc., he always lists that he worked with his hands, which, is a little hilarious that like that ends up right there next to being shipwrecked. But what he's saying is, I had to forego some of the fruit of my labors. I had to be a tent maker, et cetera, and do these things in order to be able to fund this gospel ministry. So when we do that kind of thing and forego the fruit of our labors so that Paul or whoever, can do the ministry, we are co-laboring side by side. And just one more example of that. In 2 John, you have John say that if you greet a false teacher, you're participating in his wicked works. But then in 3 John, he says, for they have gone out, speaking of missionaries, he says, for they have gone out for the sake of the name, not accepting anything from the Gentiles, no reciprocity. Therefore, we ought to be supporters of people such as these, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. So we ought to co-labor with them. There is a great partnership that happens when you are giving to your church. So hopefully it can shape some of your thoughts and give you joy as you give as well.
Yeah, that actually is like pretty exciting to think that we're all part of the body, all giving into the ministry. So it is not of charge to those that it reaches, right? I mean, you're right. I mean, I think of all throughout the book of Acts and this Paul's own writing, he's constantly like, hey, we didn't we didn't come here like trying to make you guys give us stuff or do this. Like we even helped you. We even helped set things up. We're not a burden to any of you. And all that kind of language. So it's kind of
exactly
really exciting thinking through this. Yeah. But I mean that, yeah. So that principle, I definitely see it in the text, and I appreciate you pointing that out. I think that's really great for me personally, and the listeners that will be listening, So, so I guess how that, maybe what are some more encouraging things that we could, maybe help me and my listeners understand about, maybe some real life. I know you're talking about earlier, we're talking about the academic kind of, but then you get into practical stuff and it gets a little more maybe confusing or strange.
Sure.
But have you encountered any blessing or any kind of practical experience of this principle in your local church or?
Yeah, sure. Well, with this book, my church helped pay for the printing of this book. The publisher they've been doing this kind of ministry since 2006, not just books, but other things. But with books, they've been printing the books freely, shipping them freely. And so they're covering the shipping for this book. If you go to the website, the DorianPrinciple.org, Dorian is spelled Dorean, and you order the book, the book is free and the shipping is even free. So that's a great example. I'm excited to be able to do this with there being zero inhibitions to people, getting access to this. Yeah,
that's really great. And then have you thought through at all like possible abuses of this principle? Like, is there any, what I mean, I guess, is for I'm trying to think of like people that could abuse such a thing as this, like, you are giving away these free books and your church and your people are providing the means so these books can be free, right? What if someone's like, oh, give me 300 copies for free so I can, you know what I mean? Like,
you might need to figure out ways to mitigate some of these things. Maybe not the way the publisher handles it right now is they don't fulfill orders that are greater than one unless they, do some kind of verification that this is a church that really needs it, that kind of thing. There's lots of things like that. However, I also feel like some of these problems just exist because we haven't done a lot of this yet, and aren't good at it. One of those things that I think about is, why do we care so much about physical books? I know that if you talk to a lot of book nerds, they say, oh no, I just love paper better. I feel like a lot of that is just because digital books are so bad. Like, if we had all the books freely and you were able to search them all easily and, control F over all of them, and people would want that more than their physical books if you could really do it well. But it's hard to do well when for example, someone who is developing an application or something, just doesn't have access to all the books, right? They have to get a book in whatever format it comes in or whatever, and no one even has the rights to put this into some mega database with everything standardized the way it ought to be, so that you could make a wonderful app that worked on whatever e-paper device you wanted or something like that. So I feel like part of this is just a problem because we haven't been doing this for long.
Yeah, and it makes me think too of like monergism. Like they have tons of free ebooks, like the Puritans, right, and all kinds of stuff like that. Is that because they're aware of this principle, or is there just something to do with copyright with older books that you're able to kind of make them available in the public domain?
Yeah, well, it's definitely the case that older books are in the public domain. Supposing there's not had been a recent translation or something like that, or sometimes they'll be updated into a modernized language, and then the modern English one isn't public domain, but the older ones are. So that's part of it. But certainly, I have found that people who run these websites tend to have a similar mindset to me. They haven't necessarily, put it all together with terms and categories, but I've been surprised how many people have had similar thoughts. I really anticipated this being much more controversial than it's been. There'd be much more pushback than there's been. But as I've talked to people, a lot of people have sensed that there's something off about this, and been very happy to have categories to think about it in.
Yeah. So what are some of the top objections that you've ran into, or maybe a bunch of your footnote answers to people's concerns, kind of a thing,
Sure. Well, the vast majority of objections are just misunderstandings, right? They're misunderstanding them, saying you gotta, that you shouldn't be paying your pastor, or they're a couple I ran into today, which I think were new ones, but one pointed out that the money changers in the temple were thieves, because Jesus calls it a den of thieves, that they were stealing from people. There wasn't actually anything wrong with selling in the temple, which I don't think that's the case. I don't think Jesus was accusing them of literal theft in that sense. I'd have to think about it more, but I've never appealed to that passage to support my principle. I've only appealed to that passage to point out Jesus' zeal for this particular topic of right handling of money in ministry. So people will assume that I'm making an argument. I'm not. Another one this particular individual said was that now I'm forgetting, but there's just a lot of he mentioned profit, right? A lot of people think I'm saying that you can't profit. It has nothing to do with profit. If you make more money than you put in, that's wonderful. I think every minister should, but once again, it should come from co-labor, not reciprocity. So the other more substantive objections, one of them is that this ethic is too subjective, because it sounds like I'm saying that a minister receiving or not receiving is based on the thoughts going on in someone else's head that you can't possibly know, right? How do I know whether he's giving out of a sense of reciprocity or of co-labor? First of all, I'd point to, Paul in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, and he doesn't just say, oh, well, let me clarify, how you should be giving, and then I'll accept it. He just says no. And I think that the right way of thinking about this is, I'm not claiming you need to know what's in someone else's head, but you need to do due diligence in the words and gestures of fundraising, so that no one gets the wrong idea about the origin of the gospel being from God, not being from me personally, so that you shouldn't be directly obligated to me. One other objection is that the practice of this is very difficult, because some of these categories are difficult. Like, at what point does something become reciprocity, or what point does it become co-labor, or at what point does something become ministry versus not ministry? And I think that's the harder one. Like, let's say, I give you a Bible, right? Like a Gideon's Bible or something. You shouldn't charge for that. Now, let's say like I upgrade it to being leather, and it's this really nice, $250 thing. Like, should I have to give that away for free? Should there be a room for a market for luxury Bibles? Well, I think there should. And at some point, the essence of what you're selling is not the gospel. It's this luxury product. And I don't know at what point that line should be drawn, and I'm not going to be able to give you these answers. Yeah, it's like the regulative principle of worship. If your audience is familiar with that, the the regulative principle of worship distinguishes between the elements of worship and the forms of worship. And it says that you can't change the elements, reading, praying, singing, can't change those. Now the forms, whether you sit or you stand, whether, how many songs you sing, that can change. But people differ on what the forms and the elements are. Some people say, oh, well, musical instruments, that's an element. You can't add that. That's not just a form. They have all kinds of things they would consider. So the fact that people are going to differ about like where you draw the lines on these things, I don't think undermines the principle itself. Yes, it would be nice if I could work all these things out, but I also kind of avoided it in my application chapters because I don't want people to disagree with where I've drawn the lines and then therefore reject the principle. I really want people to just agree with the principle and then let's like argue about where the lines are drawn later.
Right. Yeah. Because like any biblical principle, right, you're going to have to find ways of wisely putting those things kind of into practice. Right.
Right.
And that goes for all kinds of different doctrines or all kinds of different things in general. Right.
Right. Yeah. Just to give another example of, where's the line between ministry and non-ministry? Well, you In and Out, puts a Bible verse on the bottom of their cups. Now do they have to give, burgers and drinks for free?
Yeah.
No, I don't think, I think it's okay to frame things in biblical thought. And, you could even provide Christian education, without in charge for it, if the essence of what you're offering is not the gospel, if it's just this education that is framed in a biblical worldview, I think that kind of thing could be totally fine.
Right. Yeah. Because it's not like it's the essence of it or something isn't primarily like the gospel, but it's
right.
Maybe training for it, or maybe it's some kind of additional resources or some kind of additional I don't know, tools or something of that nature. Right. Like class on learning original languages or something. Maybe you have to purchase some little book for that or whatever the case, right? Because it's not primarily tied to access of the gospel, but it does have some kind of connection to it, but not in the fuller sense, right? So
and I think one thing that's important here too is that hopefully a Reformed audience is going to understand this well, is that when I'm saying the gospel, I'm saying more than just the good news explicitly. I'm saying, like Jesus said in Luke 24, that the whole Bible points to him. So really any kind of biblical instruction really falls into this category. If that's the essence of what you're providing is biblical instruction, biblical instruction is free to decorate things that you're selling. But if it is the essence of what you're offering, it ought to be offered freely. So I'm not just saying, well, once you've given them the good news, and you can sell whatever other kind of biblical instruction you want. No, like all of that really counts as if it's not being linked to Jesus, it ought to be like, you ought to be linking it to the gospel. You don't understand your Bible if you haven't been able to do that.
Yeah, no, that's actually super helpful. Thanks for bringing that out more, because that was my original thought. I was like, oh, is it just being like primarily like the gospel of salvation, repentance unto life, that kind of a thing, or a more full-orbed biblical worldview, some kind of biblical framework in general? So that's really helpful.
Right.
Yeah. So have you had any praise from the book? Has anybody been up in you or up in this principle, helping you out?
Sure. So there's been the book itself has some good endorsements. The one I was the happiest with, but I'm disappointed at how few people recognize him, is David Garland, who wrote what I consider to be the best best commentaries on 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And that's just huge for me, because most of the book is about 1st and 2nd Corinthians. So there's a lot of others too, but you can check the endorsements. And then A.D. Robles has had me on his podcast a couple of times, and that's been really helpful in trying to get the word out.
That's good. Yeah, I do know who David Garland is, actually. So
awesome.
I'm pretty cool, I guess. Right? He's a commentating. He writes commentaries and more academic work, correct? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. He's a professor. His commentary on 1 Corinthians is just so excellent. It's one of the best commentaries I've read.
That's great. Yeah, man. Well, that's exciting stuff. So how long has the book been out currently now? Is it
the very end of September is when we launched it.
Okay, so just this
the end of last year.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Yeah. So is there anything else that you would love to share? Maybe maybe anything else that you could think of that might be just floating thoughts that you've experienced having regarding your book that might be helpful to fully, maybe answer some of those possible objections or.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's just no end to objections when people when they feel like this is challenging the way things are. But yeah, I'm hoping that people who have less of a dog in the fight will be, more interested and open to this. Just one consideration, just thinking through some of the verses that are helpful, because I haven't quoted that many verses on this show yet. Well, I'll just go ahead and quote some. 2 Corinthians 2:17 says, for we are not like so many peddlers of God's word, but as men of sincerity in the sight of God, we speak in Christ. So yeah, this is about sincerity. Someone who is exchanging the gospel for money is undermining the sincerity of ministry. Micah 3:11 says, its heads give judgment for a bribe, its priests teach for a price, its prophets practice divination for money. Yet they lean on the Lord and say, is not the Lord in the midst of us? No disaster shall come upon us. So here you have the crooked people in Israel, prophets, priests, and judges, a judge being a mini king. These are the same offices of Christ, prophet, priest, and king. And as we are a royal priesthood, and we are to be essentially prophets, not in the sense of giving, inspired words, but in repeating God's inspired words, we ought to be doing these things as God would have us to do. And you see a bad example in the Old Testament where their prophets, priests, and judges were doing so for money. We ought to be a people who are not doing so in exchange for money. One other thing that comes to mind that a lot of people have found helpful, which, honestly, I only threw it in the book as kind of like a side thought, but is just how important this should be for discernment. So I've got this, try to hold it up to the camera. I've got this Venn diagram where basically, a lot of people think of greedy teachers and false teachers as being this overlapping Venn diagram where some greedy teachers are false and some false teachers are greedy. But biblically, because the Bible really pierces to the heart and isn't as concerned with just how things look on the surface, it points out that someone who is a false teacher, you can either serve God or money. So they are necessarily doing it for the sake of gain. So the primary way you're supposed to be able to discern a false teacher is by their handling of money, is by their fidelity to this principle. So right now, that's kind of up in the air because so many of the true teachers are engaged in reciprocity. But if we could recapture this could once again be like the primary tool that you use, just like the Didache advocates for, of discerning whether or not a teacher is a true teacher or a false teacher. That's another really important thing that should be that would be gained if we could recapture this principle.
Yeah, that's really helpful to think of it in terms of like even like elders and deacons, right? And thinking how that relates to that office and those qualifications, right?
Right. Yeah. If they they're not supposed to be lovers of money, etc. And Paul, in one of those lovers of money passage, Paul says, if anyone comes to you with a different doctrine, he is, and then lists all these things and then says a lover of money. A lot of people don't like thinking that, well, because you have all kinds of people who have, well, aren't there people who have a different doctrine, but they're ascetics who don't have much money? They've always got some kind of personal interest, right? And usually that is most often expressed as a desire for money. And the same thing the other way around. Well, don't you have true teachers who are violating this? Yes, but that's not how it's supposed to be. Out of the heart, the mouth speaks, but, we're all sinners and we err in these things. So, if we can recapture this, then maybe we can more directly see the heart from the fruit.
Right. And what are some of the things that you could point me and my listeners to, like practically, like how do you start engaging and maybe sharing this like with our pastors, our elders,
sure,
things of that nature?
Well, yeah, because the book is free of charge and the shipping is free of charge, it costs you nothing just to get an extra copy. Like I said, the publisher won't necessarily fulfill it if you ordered for two, but if you order another one a month later, they will. So just get one and hand it to your pastor, ask him what he thinks about it. That's one way, link him to this video maybe. There's all kinds of things you could do. If you're on Facebook, there's a group I'm running that I'm hoping to form a community talking about this called Money and Ministry Dorian Discussions. So if you search Money and Ministry, you should be able to find that. That's a good place to head to if you want to try to organize around this.
Great. And you said that's Facebook?
Yes, that's on Facebook.
Gotcha. So not on the metaverse yet. That might come later, right?
No.
Yeah. Well, that's really encouraging. And then I'm trying to think too, like, what are, I guess, have you thought through it all, like what possible authors and publishers can starting to think through about how they go about if they publish books and whatnot? Like,
yeah, well, I mean, all kinds of people can think about this. Unfortunately, a lot of the publishers are built around this. They don't necessarily have church ties where they could just easily transition to, being funded. But, for authors, if your heart is pricked by this, and you hear this call to reformation, there are publishers who would be willing to work with you. My own publisher, First Love Ministries, like I said, they've been doing this since 2006. So there are people willing to work with you. And it's not just for publishers, it's really for or authors, it's for all kinds of things. I think of worship music too. So many people publish their worship music for money. The CCLI is essentially this worship tax that a church has to pay before they get to to worship freely. So there's just all kinds of little things that we can push back on to hopefully remediate the problem step by step.
Yeah, because it's definitely one of those things. It's probably such a comfortable, free-flowing, running thing that a lot of people will avoid it just because of how radical maybe the shift would be for a lot you
Right.
know. So
Yes.
that's definitely a hindrance for sure.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be that radical. Like,
Hey.
if you can just find willing donors, and there are all kinds of tools these days. There's like Patreon and Kickstarter and whatever. If you don't already have a church network that would, that has the mechanisms that you would typically use to fund these sorts of things. But there's just a lot of options these days.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Well, yeah, I don't know if you wanted to give a plug for Log College as well, because they're another great ministry that I really appreciate how Log goes about how they, how they do things, like
Right.
raising up leaders in the local church, having mentors, having I forget what's the model called again. I think it's just called, I don't know, biblical.
I forget. No. Yeah. See, I went through it while it was still the North American Reformed Seminary, so I don't know if they've changed some of these things. But John McDonald, who's been on this show before, he is one of the endorsers of the book too. So yes, it's a good school. I've been through it, and they're free of charge. And there are other schools like that too. They're not the only ones. So this is something that's very doable these days. And it was doable before too, but there's less of an excuse with the more tools that are available.
Right. Yeah, and it's super encouraging for anyone listening that is not aware of John McDonald or the Log College and Seminary. Definitely check that out on Google. It's a great opportunity for those that would like to grow and possibly grow to be an elder or something of that nature, to be involved in ministry, or just to be trained, right? It's a really great opportunity for you to get connected, not just with seminary kind of level courses, but also just involved in possibly being mentored by a pastor or an elder in your local church. So it's a really great opportunity. Yeah. So, Conley, did you have anything else you'd like to talk about or say?
Yeah. So one kind of hopeful note I've been contemplating lately is, you and I just before the show were talking about or no, maybe it was actually during the show. We were talking about the money changers at the temple, and I forget if it was during or before, but anyway, while I've never appealed to that to support this particular principle, it does show Jesus's zeal for the ministry. And something I've been considering lately is the relationship of Jesus's cursing of the fig tree to that. Different gospels record it slightly differently, but Mark, Jesus curses the fig tree. He goes and he cleanses the temple, and then he comes back out and he explains the fig tree. And I'm just going to assume that your audience is somewhat familiar with all this, but when he explains the fig tree, he says, let's see. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father who is in heaven may forgive your trespasses. As Jesus is dealing with the corruption of money in the temple, and when I've talked to other people about this particular issue, a lot of people feel like this is kind of hopeless. This is a David and Goliath situation. But you look at this, and Jesus, surrounding that interaction in the temple, talks about the power of prayer to correct such things, specifically this issue of corruption of money and religion. I think if we as a church, just really unite in prayer around this issue, the mountain will be cast into the sea, and we can have a serious reformation that will be for the good of God's people.
Yeah, that's super encouraging. And thanks for that, Conley. It's been a privilege to have you come on and discuss these things. I hope it's inspiring enough to get people to not go purchase a book, but actually go receive a free copy of a book, because that's, it starts closer to home and works its way out. Right. And,
right.
And we appreciate you too, Conley, for publishing this book and then making it available for people to be able to receive without charge, and be able to read that. And thanks for putting in the principle in the practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let me just add that if you go to that website, the DorianPrinciple.org, there's also all kinds of digital formats. It's on the website itself. There's PDF and EPUB. You can get it on Kindle, and there's even an audiobook. If you feel like you don't have enough time to read, but you want to just search for it in your podcatcher, just search for it in your podcatcher, and in a few hours at whatever time speed you can listen to this. It's not too long.
Gotcha. And I'll make sure that I definitely put some links in the description for you guys, so you'll have a way to receive it, whether voice or paperback, Kindle, whatever the case. Seems like it's all available for you guys to select at your own choosing. So so this was great, Conley. Thanks so much. Did you have any concluding any thoughts or anything like that?
No, yeah, the gospel is given to you freely, so you should be offering it freely. And if it seems too hard, the Lord is faithful. He will take care of his servants.
Amen. That's a good reminder, brother. All right, guys. Well, until next time, this was Rooted in Revelation podcast, where we seek to make God's revelation our foundation in all of life. And have a good one.